Hi, I'm the History Guy. I have a degree in history and I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. 636 years ago today, on June 13th, 1381, during the reign of King Richard II, a mob of rebels entered London. They burned several royal buildings and murdered several representatives of the crown. Wat Tyler's rebellion was well recorded at the time, and it has been studied many times throughout history, and the interpretation of the events has often been skewed by the politics of the time that the history was written. But regardless of those interpretations, everyone can agree that the rebellion in 1381 represented the politics and economics of a singular time in European history, and it deserves to be remembered. The rebellion, which is sometimes called the Peasants' Revolt, although that is not an apt term, since England didn't use the term peasants for about another 100 years, and many of the people involved in the revolt came from wealthier classes, was impacted by two great events that were driving history in Europe at the time: the Great Pestilence and the 100 Years' War. The pneumonic plague pandemic, originally called the Great Pestilence or the Great Mortality, likely started in China and followed trade routes back to Europe. The first known case in England was in June of 1348 from a sailor that had traveled from France. The disease is a bacterial infection, and it is acquired from fleas that come on rats, but also from infected people, and it quickly spread throughout the island. And the estimates are that the first wave, the first pandemic of the pneumonic plague in England, killed between 1/4 and 2/3 of the population of the entire island. And there was a second pneumonic plague pandemic in 1361. But as terrible as the death toll was, the depopulation that was caused by the plague actually ended up being an economic boom for people who worked the land. Prior to the plague, Europe was overpopulated. Land was scarce and workers were abundant, and so a worker could not command much value for their labor. And workers were essentially held as a form of slavery that was called serfdom, where they were tied to land that was owned by a local lord. But the depopulation caused by the plague completely changed that equation, and as labor became scarce, laborers could demand more in return for their work, and this caused a massive redistribution in wealth. But this threatened the existing power structures, and the landholders obviously didn't like it. And so in 1351, under the reign of Richard II's grandfather, Edward III, Parliament passed an act called the Statute of Laborers. And in short, what the act did was set a maximum pay that a worker could receive and prohibited workers from leaving their home area in search of better working conditions. The act generally failed in what it was trying to do, but what it really did was make the workers angry, and the often brutal enforcement of the act enraged the working class. The conflict that would eventually be called the 100 Years' War had to do with the King of England, Edward III, trying to claim the throne of France through a claim that he made through his mother, Isabella of France. The conflict had to do with a lot of things, fighting over tribute that was owed because of English possessions in France, Gascony and Normandy, constant conflicts between England and Scotland, which was an ally of France, and initially England scored significant victories against France, notably the Battle of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Poitiers in 1348. Although the arrival of the bubonic plague meant that the depopulation in England kept them from doing much warfighting on the continent for several years. But France was much larger than England, and so they were able to stave off destruction and continue the war. And by the time of Richard II, the cost of the 100-Year War was not only constantly draining the royal coffers, but was causing an economic depression in England. The war was limiting international trade, and that was hurting the British textile industry, and that was causing economic depression. And at the same time, France was constantly threatening cross-channel raids, and that meant that the king had to maintain garrisons all along the coast, and that was expensive. And in order to pay those costs, Parliament created an entirely new kind of tax in England. It was called the poll tax. Now, the idea of the poll tax was to increase the size of the tax base in order to raise more money, and to put a tax essentially on every person in England over the age of 14. And it was high enough that it could create a significant hardship for someone in the working class. The tax ended up being regressive. It ended up hurting the working class much more than the wealthier classes, and it also didn't seem fair, and so there was widespread tax evasion. And the brutal attempts to try to collect the tax were even more unpopular than the tax itself. These tensions came together in 1381 for the first large-scale revolt in the history of England. The king, Richard II, had been the grandson of the King Edward III, and his father, Edward the Black Prince, and older brother, Edward of Angoulême, had died ahead of him, and so he had become the heir, and upon the death of his grandfather, he became King of England at just the age of 10. At the time of Wat Tyler's rebellion, he was only 14 years old. The spark for the rebellion in Essex had to do with the poll tax. A tax collector came to the town of Fobbing, demanding to know why the tax had not been paid. The town refused to pay, and so the tax collector tried to arrest the man that was speaking on behalf of the town. So the town rose up and chased the tax collector out of town, killing 3 of his clerks. In nearby Kent, the spark was the statute of laborers. A local landholder had accused a local laborer of leaving his serfdom, which was illegal under the act. When they arrested the laborer, the townsfolk rose up and attacked the jail and released him. Both groups then started to march towards London, gathering more and more rebels as they went along. And on June 7th, in a mass meeting, the rebels elected as their leader a man named Wat Tyler. Wat Tyler was a tradesman and a longbowman, and by all accounts, a charismatic leader. The king was caught off guard. Most of the royal army was north, fighting in Scotland, and so he had very few troops to defend himself. And London was having its own troubles, with tensions between the increasingly empowered trading class and the nobility, and anger over the ongoing depression. When the thousands of rebels showed up in London, the gates were left open for them. For a rebellion, they were remarkably well behaved. There was very little looting, although there was some drunkenness. But what they did do was travel throughout London, attacking the people that they held responsible for their troubles. Anybody who represented, say, royal tax collection. They burned the beautiful home of John of Gaunt, the king's uncle. They destroyed the priory of the Knights Hospitaller, whose head was the head of the royal treasury. They stomped around town, catching royal officers and burning their homes. The king met personally with the rebels on June 14th and promised many significant reforms, including abolishing the practice of serfdom. But while the king was meeting with Wat Tyler, another group of rebels attacked the Tower of London, and the gate had been left open, awaiting the return of the king, so they were able to run right in. And there they attacked everybody they didn't like. They killed the king's chancellor, who also happened to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. They killed the king's Lord High Treasury. They killed several other nobles. They threatened the king's family. And while the rebels were able to take London and take revenge on many of the people they blamed for their woes, the rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful. The king met with Wat Tyler again the next day, and in a disputed event where Tyler was said to be disrespectful of the king, the mayor of London drew his sword and killed Wat Tyler, and Tyler's troops dispersed. There were more rebellions in the countryside, there were more royal representatives who were executed, royal properties and church properties looted, but when the king had time to raise militia, he was able to easily come out and defeat the rebels, and their leaders were tracked down and tried and hanged. And the king rescinded the reforms that he had promised on June 14th. But conditions did get slightly better for workers in England, because while the statute of laborers still existed, the landholders were much more reticent to enforce it for fear of sparking another rebellion, and so workers were able to improve their lot, and wages in England in the 100 years between 1350 and 1450 roughly doubled. There were other rebellions on the continent that were fairly similar, driven by the economic impacts of the depopulation of the plague that also led to incremental improvements in workers' lot as Europe slowly changed to a more modern economy. The plague itself would come back again and again, and it struck London in 1665 with what was called the Great Plague of London. And it was then in the latter half of the 17th century that it gained its more well-known name, today known as the Black Death. It wouldn't be eradicated clear until the 19th century, having killed some 100 million people worldwide. In the end, maybe the most important impact of the Wat Tyler Rebellion of 1381 was the impact it had on the young King Richard II. Richard II became convinced that he had been betrayed by his advisors, and over his reign he became more and more dependent upon a smaller and smaller circle of confidants, and that alienated the rest of the nobility and played a significant role in his being deposed as king in 1399 and his death, likely of forced starvation, in 1400. And it was the ascension of his cousin, who became Henry IV of England, that would give rise to decades of conflict in England with the War of the Roses and eventually the rise of the Tudor dynasty. And so the rebellion of 1381 had significant impacts on the history of England and the history of Europe, and it was all driven by the specific economic impacts of the massive war and the massive pestilence that came at that time. And that significant event deserves to be remembered. I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series, 5 Minutes of History, short snippets of forgotten history, 5 to 10 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click the thumbs up button that is there on your left. If you have any questions or comments or would like to recommend another topic for the History Guy, please feel free to write that in the comment section. I will be happy to respond. And if you'd like 5 minutes more of forgotten history, all you need to do is click that subscribe button that is there on your right.